Welcome now officially. I'm Paul North. I teach critical theory at Yale. I'm happy to present today's speaker in the series that I'm hosting together with my colleague at Ohio State University, Paul Reiter. The series is called The Value of Marx's Capital. And these are the Franke Lectures in the Humanities at the Whitney Humanities Center at Yale. I need to thank the Franke family who make possible the Franke Lectures. That's Richard and Barbara Franke. And these lectures are intended to present important topics in the humanities to a wide and general audience. I need to thank, as I always do, Alice Kaplan for making this possible, who stepped in to direct the Whitney Humanities Center right when the pandemic hit. And so there's a lot of plans and lots of interesting things are going to happen as time moves on. I need to thank Sandra Malan-Bowles and Leanna Hirschfeld-Kroen for doing the organizational side, and Audrey Leek, who's a technical genius and a brilliant undergraduate at Yale. Thank you very much, Audrey, for running the show. Okay, this is the way it's going to work as it has in the past. We'll have the presentation from our speaker and then we'll take questions. I want to give room for the students in the seminar that I'm running on Marx's Capital Volume 1, time to ask questions. But I think we'll ask everyone to put their questions in the chat after the presentation is over, so we don't lose track of them. Hang on to them, write them down, and I will open up the floor when things end. I'm really excited to welcome our guest in this way of welcoming where we're just having faces hanging on screens. But I have been reading a quote from a text from our speakers as they come in. So I'm going to start with a quote from our speaker from an early book, an important book among many important books. Here's the quote. This is my translation. Marx does not intend a moral criticism of capitalism. It is not a question of justice or the violation of certain norms, but rather of the confirmation of a state of affairs. That capitalist production damages elementary vital interests of workers. In order to establish this, no quote, right to an undamaged life, unquote, needs to be postulated or anything like it. Marx wants to show scientifically, wissenschaftlich, that this violation of vital interests is inextricably bound up with the capitalist system. And insofar as insight into this characteristic of the capitalist system grows for the working class, it will also lead to political action, not in the name of universal justice, but in its own interest. At least that is the optimistic hope of Marx. This is a quote from a book that was originally published in 1991 by Michael Heinrich, our guest today. The book is Die Wissenschaft vom Wert, which is going into one of the multiple editions that his books tend to go through. Michael Heinrich is a former collaborator of the Marx-Engels-Gesamtausgabe and was, until 2016, professor of economics at the HTW in Berlin. His accomplishments on paper are many, and his books are by now, some of them in double digits of editions. I hate to look at a long career writing in German only from the English language perspective, but to make this short for those listening, you can read several titles in English. First of all, an introduction to the 3 volumes of Marx's Capital, the most reasonable, the most introductory and undistorted view, I would say, of the volumes as they need to go together. We can read in English the first volume of what I think is a projected 3-volume biography of Marx. Is that right?
4 volumes.
4 volumes, sorry. And that is published in English, the first volume, Karl Marx and the Birth of the Modern Society from 2019. A further commentary, How to Read Marx's Capital, which is an extensive commentary on the beginning chapters, is in the works in English, will come out from Monthly Review Press. And again, for those of you who can read German, I want to point you to this important leap in the ballet of the debate over the theory of value, Die Wissenschaft vom Wert from 1991, a really valuable and important contribution. Thank you for coming, Michael. Welcome, and I'll give the floor over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for invitation to speak here. And also Thank you very much for the introduction. I just have to add one point to the way you introduced me. The book you mentioned, Wissenschaft vom Wert, will also appear in English finally next year. And it is my thickest book. The first edition from 91 was considerably extended in 99. And of course, the extended version will appear in English. So now, also, I have to excuse my poor English. When I hear myself later, I see how many mistakes I make, but I hope at least the sense of the sentences will become clear, although the English is a little bit poor sometimes. I was invited here to talk about Marx value theory, and the original title of my talk was Marx monetary value theory. I changed a little bit the title. Perhaps you saw it when I sent the table of contents. I added reading Marx monetary value theory. I did this because at first we really have to talk about in which way do we talk about Marx value theory. Very usual and widespread is a way of talking that maybe I present my interpretation. It is opposed to some alternative interpretations. I support my interpretation with some quotes from Marx. My opponent supports his or her interpretation with some other quotes. And when I found 5 quotes in favor of my interpretation and the opponent found only 3 quotes, then it looks like that I'm the winner of the game, like in a soccer game. But this is, of course, nonsense to treat the things like this. Of course, we have to read cautiously the texts, but we cannot reduce reading of finding appropriate quotations. And insofar, I will start with the prerequisites of discussing Marx value theory. I think there are 2 prerequisites. The first is a kind of double historiography, and the other is that we really need a critical reading instead of looking for a last version. What these points mean, I will explain first, and then I will come to the critical issues of Marx value theory and the consequences of these issues for the understanding of capitalism. So what do I mean with double historiography? By the way, I used historiography as translation for the German Historisierung. I hope it fits more or less. I think we must put in a historiography as well our own point of view, as well Marx's situation and his writing about his issues. So what means historiography of our own talking about Marx value theory? When we talk about Marx, our views are not only influenced by our own positions, they are also influenced by our historical situation in a very wide understanding. For example, talking about Marx before the Russian Revolution and after was a big difference. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union and after is a big difference. So historical events play a role, but also theoretical events play a role. Already in the social democracy in the very late 19th century, started a talk about dialectical materialism as philosophical basis, historical materialism as the approach to history of Marxism. But we have to have in mind that all these terms didn't appear in Marx's writings. He never used the term dialectical materialism. He never used the term historical materialism. And about Marxism, he did this famous phrase, "I am not a Marxist." And it was not a phrase only, it expressed a distrust against ism. So Marx not at all wanted to be the founder of an ism, but nevertheless, such categories are taken mostly for granted when we talk about Marx. And I cannot go deeper in this discussion. I just want to say we have very cautious in using such categories. When we now come to discussing value theory, an additional historical difficulty emerges. Just a few years after Marx published Capital Volume 1 in the year 1867, the so-called marginal revolution started in economics. Karl Menger in Austria, Leo Walras in Switzerland, and William Stanley Jevons in England published independently studies promoting the so-called marginal utility theory. It was a new approach to bring utility into economic thinking. Adam Smith denied that utility can explain value. The marginalists, with this marginal utility, renewed the approach. And it lasted only 20 years that this new approach became dominant. And this had enormous consequences for the perception and also for the discussion of Marx's value theory. The tradition of the marginalists, they created a new view on the possible value theories. On the one hand, it was said we have the so-called objective theories of value, resting on labor production costs. On the other hand, we have the subjective theories of value. They are built on consumer preferences and utility. In this distinction, Marx and the classical political economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo are in one camp. The differences between them are minimized. And for many readers, no matter if Marxists or critics of Marx, the original claim of Marx to deliver a fundamental critique of classical political economy disappeared. So it was only the question, a labor theory, when we talk about value, do we have a labor theory of value or do we have a utility theory of value? But I think this way of framing value theory is totally misleading, not only at Marx, already with Smith. Smith justified labor as a measure of value by the subjective evaluation of the producer, where he said, yes, labor is the real cost because it provokes misery to the producer, and he will not have an exchange of a labor product with something else which he can get for less labor. So Adam Smith, in a subjective way, gave reason to the so-called objective approach to value theory. So I think all these distinctions, objective, subjective, labor theories, utility theories, have only a very, very limited use, but nevertheless, they are used in a way as if we can take them for granted. A last point I want to mention what is important for our present perception of Marx, or of not of Marx theory in general, but of capital. Capital has, as we know, 3 volumes. Unfortunately, most people read only volume 1, but the 3 volumes of Capital form a unit. Very important categories like profit and interest appear only in volume 3. When you don't know what Marx means with profit, you will automatically tend to confuse surplus value, category of volume 1, with profit and entrepreneurial gain, categories of volume 3. So we really need all 3 volumes to read. But when we look to history, volume 1 appeared in the year 1867. Volume 3, after Marx's death, edited by his friend Friedrich Engels, appeared nearly 30 years later in 1894. And while volume 1 was nicely finished by Marx, was nicely presented by Marx, volume 2 and 3, Engels had to construct out of unfinished manuscripts, and to read it is much more difficult than to read volume 1. As a result, since 100 years, we have the situation that volume 1 dominates the reception of capital. Volume 1 deals with the production process of capital, and many Marxists, as well as Marx critics, believe here we find the real core of Marx analysis of capitalism, and what is said in volume 2 or 3 are some details, additional details. We must not go too much in depth occupying with them. And I think this is a very wrong interpretation, a very wrong accentuation of capital. So these were some very brief remarks about the historiography of our own position, that we have to be cautious to take things for granted which are the result of a certain historical process. We just shouldn't trust what is offered as categories, things we can take for granted. Now I come to my second point, the historiography of Marx analysis of value. In general, we have to put Marx theoretical texts much more in the conflicts of his times than this is usually done. Most readers of Capital, they want to learn something about contemporary capitalism. It is said, yes, Marx is an important author, he has something to say, read it. And they read it, but most readers are not clear about the fact that all Marx texts, also Capital, is an intervention in debates, in conflicts, in struggles of his times. It is not a timeless analytical effort to contribute to the wisdom of human mankind. And so we have to reconstruct all these contemporary, for Marx, contemporary struggles and debates in order to get a deeper understanding of the writings. And you mentioned my Marx biography. This is one of the main tasks of this biography. It is not to tell you every detail of Marx's life and what was his dinner on Sunday evening or something like that. No, I think we need the biography for really have the context of his writings, to understand the conflicts, to understand also Marx standing in these conflicts, which was changing. Marx was all his lifetime an extremely learning subject who had no problems to admit that something what he wrote or said 2 years ago was wrong, that he had now a new insight which has to be taken into account. This, by the way, is also a reason that why so many of Marx's works, including Capital, were not finished, because he was permanently learning. He did not just fulfill a program and send the manuscript to the reader. So just for Capital, I think I can say that it was not finished in the 70s. It had, of course, one of the reasons were that Marx was sick in the 70s, that also in the early 70s, he was politically very engaged, very active, but also in the 1870s, he extended the plan for Capital considerably. And I would say he extended it even so much that even when he lived 10 years more and would have the best health, he wouldn't be able to finish this extremely ambitious project. And also this we have to have in mind when we discuss about Capital, that we have not one finished project. We have an evolving project. We have to see how things are developing. I will come back to this point in short. Now I just want to give you a very, very rough idea what were the struggles behind Capital. Marx, of course, dealt with the existing political economy. This political economy was one of the main justifying sciences for capitalism. So it was not just a scientific debate, it was a debate about a science which has central importance for capitalism. And in these times, in Capital, he made the famous distinction between classical political economy on the one hand, which he accepted as a scientific approach, a bourgeois approach, but nevertheless a scientific approach, and vulgar economics, which was not really scientific. It remained on the surface, and in the course of time, more and more, this what he called vulgar economics became more and more apologetic. It was clear for the writers, we have to defend capitalism and we have to present capitalism in a way that it is the best world ever. But there is a third branch, not so, Marx made it not so prominent, but you can see it in some footnotes, in some remarks. This was especially the German economists of his time. He considered German economists of his time even worse than the vulgar economists. Germany developed rather late economically. It was behind England and France in the first half of the 19th century. So there was not really an empirical basis for doing political economy. And the German economists took some fragments from Adam Smith, Ricardo, say, which they not even really understood. They mixed it up with some German historical consideration. And the result for Marx was not at all a serious project. Another frontline for Marx where competing socialist thinkers, for example, Proudhon, who he mentioned several times in Capital, they also made use of classical political economy in a way which Marx criticized very much. So Marx had to fight against very different camps in his Capital. I will mention later what this means for certain points. But now I have to mention in this paragraph just one point regarding the publication of Capital. I said the German economists were even worse than the vulgar economists in England and France. But in which language and where Capital was published? In Germany. Marx, in his letters, said, oh, nobody really discusses Capital, and he talked about a conspiracy of silence. My idea is there was not so much a conspiracy of silence against the book. There was the German economists in the majority were really unable to understand the book. They were before unable to understand really classical political economy, and so they didn't understand the critique of classical political economy. They also thought that it is not necessary to criticize because the critique of the Germans was, oh, David Ricardo is too abstract. We cannot use such an abstract theory. And this was reason enough to say, oh, we must not occupy. But now you can say, okay, Marx's book was not, it didn't aim to the academic debate in Germany. It was a book with socialist aims. It was written to support the proletarian relation, the proletarian revolution, a book for workers. But could the workers really make use of Capital in this time? There were first the selling price of the book. The first edition had a price which was around the weekly income of a skilled worker. So for the most workers in Germany, the book was not affordable. In the first edition, also Marx didn't, and also in later editions, he didn't translate the quotes from foreign languages. You could find 5 different languages in Capital: ancient Greek, Latin, English, French, and Italian. He used a lot of terms from ancient mythology, philosophy, world literature, and so on. So it was really a book for the educated, very well educated reader. And these were, in these times, mainly the bourgeoisie. So it is not surprising that his book was not really a success in the first years after it was published. And when finally, 20 years after the first edition, an English translation appeared, then Marx's opponent, classical political economy, already had vanished. Marginalists were ruling. So the book looked like a relic of an old time, which has no meaning for the present times. So regarded under marketing aspects, Capital during the first 20 years was really a disaster. And also, of course, this then influenced the reception. Now, I want to come to my next point before I then really come to the critical issues of value theory. I mentioned that we need a critical reading of Marx texts. There is, not only in reading Marx, but also in reading a lot of other so-called classical authors, a tendency to look for a last version where the author said what he really wanted to say. In most cases, the search for such an illusionary, for such a last version is really illusionary. In Germany, this insight is rather old, and it led to the so-called critical editions. Not only to edit the so-called last version of a book, but to publish all the versions of the book, to publish also all the changes in a single text. In Germany, we have, fortunately, the Marx-Engels-Gesamtausgabe, which it is not finished, but which gives such a critical edition, which then makes possible such a critical reading. What this critical reading had, the impact of this critical reading, even for volume 1, to illustrate this, I just give you one example. You can hear very often the opinion that the French translation of volume 1 is the last version, because chronologically it appeared after the first 2 German editions, and it was really the last edition which was on which Marx was working. He checked the translation and changed a lot of points, and even Marx wrote, yes, when you can read German, nevertheless read the French to the French readers. He said, even when you can read German, you should read this French edition. It has an scientific value of its own. But this is not the full truth. The French edition brings a lot of new insights, new material, for example, in the section on accumulation. But in the section on value, it's a disaster. And this also was confirmed by Marx when Danielson, the translator for the Russian edition, asked what is best to do. Marx told him, use the second German edition, compare with the French edition, but not for the first chapters. Here you have to take only the German edition. What happened with these first chapters in the French translation was simply that Marx was not at all satisfied with the translation of the French translator, but he had not the time to find better translations. So in many cases, he just erased sentences, half paragraphs. When my commentary to the first few chapters was translated in France, there was a big problem that in this standard translation, a lot of sentences I commented, they didn't exist in this book. In your translations, they added these sentences as an appendix. But as you can imagine, most readers didn't read the appendix. So the translation or this so-called last version was really a problem for understanding capital. So now, this was a long introduction, but I think it a necessary introduction. I come to some critical points of Marx value theory. Many Marxists, as many Marx critics, have a very simple view on value theory. When you ask them what tells you value theory, they say, okay, labor creates value, the magnitude of value the magnitude of labor spent in production gives us the magnitude of value. So it looks like that production already determines value and its magnitude. And money is just an expression of value which exists also without regarding money. All these propositions I just quoted in a briefly way are very, very problematic. And this I want to show now in this third part about the critical points of Marx value theory. First, we have to be clear about Marx's way of presenting things. For example, when you read the first two chapters of Capital, many readers are puzzled. In chapter 1, in value form analysis, you find money. In chapter 2, you again can find money. What's the difference? And many say, okay, even you can read this in commentaries, the presentation in chapter 2 is a more concrete presentation. This is nonsense. There is a very clear division between chapter 1 and chapter 2. Chapter 1 presents the form determination, and chapter 2 presents human action ruled by this form determination. Probably most of you remember this famous sentence from the preface that that Marx criticizes the actions of capitalists and landowners, but he is not dealing with the character of these persons because they don't play a role as persons, but as personifications of economic categories. Probably you know this sentence, you all know this sentence, maybe you quoted it, you used it, but this sentence implies a very ambitious program. When I really want to present persons as personifications of economic categories, I must present first the economic categories independently from the persons. This already is a scientific program in total contrast to the program of classical political economy as well neoclassical political economy, because both start with the individual and the needs, the desire, the possibilities of the individual. And only from the action of the individual, they derive economic institutions. Marx goes the opposite way. In chapter 1, his object is the exchange relation of commodities. In chapter 2, his object is the exchange process of commodity owners. And they do this following their free will. But this free will, when they want to avoid economic bankruptcy, has to follow the form determinations analyzed in chapter 1. So, and this pattern also exists later in chapter 4. Marx analyzes capital, and only this, in a very short remark, he comes to the capitalist, who makes the objective aim of capital to his or her subjective aim. So this we have to have in mind. Do we speak about form determinations or do we speak about action? It makes a big difference for Marx.
Mikhail, can I ask you a question?
Of course.
At this point, I would like to know your opinion on this choice of Marx to do science in this way, to start with the categories to imagine that persons are personifications of categories. Where does that come from? Or let me ask you this, what in capital makes it right that you make this scientific choice?
Okay, these are two different questions. Where it comes from is more or less a biographically a question, which were the learning processes of Marx to do this. Because in the 1840s, it was not so clear, this difference. I think it started in early 1850s, in his notebooks, where he was working day after day in the British Museum in London. To justify this program, we just have to see if the analysis works. When we look, for example, in chapter 2 in Capital already, Marx tries to explain on a rather general, abstract level what commodity owners have to do. And there we can check, is this analysis convincing that what they have to do is exactly the form determination analyzed in chapter 1? We have to discuss this. And here, this is just in brackets said, the first edition, the value form analysis of the first edition in this respect is much more precise than in the second edition. The first edition starts with a different force value form, not already with the money form, but with a kind of crazy value form where every commodity is the general equivalent. But exactly this appears in chapter 2, where Marx, I think, very clearly states, what do the commodity owners desire? Every commodity owner has the desire that his or her commodity is the general equivalent. So the crazy force value form of the first edition is exactly the desire of the commodity owners, which is not realistic, and therefore they have to come to money. So the program, I think, is convincing of Marx, but this doesn't mean that the way Marx presented this program is correct or convincing in every detail. There is some work to do. So now I want to come to the next critical point, double character of labor. Everybody knows this, really. In an audience, I would ask, where is my mistake when I say double character of labor? Marx didn't speak of double character of labor. He spoke about the double character of labor represented in commodities. Double character is not a not historical feature of any labor. It is a feature of labor represented in commodities. So it is a historical feature only existing in a commodity producing society. Here again, we have a decisive critique against Adam Smith and the classical school, because they not only don't do this this differentiation, double character, abstract and concrete labor, they confuse concrete labor, what we have in every society, with abstract labor, what belongs to commodity production. And by this confusion, they make commodity production to something which has to exist always. And the laws of commodity production and of capitalist commodity production for Adam Smith are the laws of the economy. So this is a very critical distinction, critic against the classical school, but also it is very important for the later use in capital when you come to the difference, for example, between constant and variable capital, again plays this double character a decisive role. But what I want to stress here in connecting this value theory is that how did we find abstract labor? We needed the exchange process. In the exchange process, there is an abstraction from use value. When we abstract from every use value, then automatically the labor changes. It is not anymore a concrete labor. It is a kind of abstract labor. It is not an abstraction done consciously by someone. It is a practical abstraction existing in everyday practice. But this means that abstract labor is connected to exchange. When we only consider production, we cannot talk about abstract labor and not talk about value. The same, by the way, is true regarding the magnitude of value. You all know the famous definition from the first 5-6 pages of the first chapter, that not the individually spent labor time forms the magnitude of value, but only socially necessary labor time. But what is socially necessary labor time? It is labor time which in average at a certain situation is necessary. But which labor enters this average? Not all the labor spent in production, but only that labor whose products enter the market. When you have a perfect factory which will not deliver products to the market, the labor conditions of this factory will not influence socially necessary labor time. So also about the magnitude of value, we can only speak regarding not only production, but production and exchange. The third of these critical points, value form. I already mentioned it shortly. Value form in the first chapter, from simple value form to money form. Very often it is misunderstood as a kind of abbreviated historical development of money. But when you read cautiously already the introductory part of this subchapter on value form, then you can see Marx is not speaking about money. He is speaking about the money form, the necessity of the money form. The necessity of a form is not a historical event, and the necessity of a form relates to the system of categories with which I describe an existing totality. Is it necessary to have this form in order to describe, to analyze this totality, or is it not? The background of this seemingly abstract reasoning is very political. When Marx started with Grundrisse, he was occupied with a pupil of Proudhon, a French author named Darimont. And there he discussed, Darimont discussed the Proudhon thesis, what is socialism, and Marx went into this discussion. Proudhon's basic idea was to introduce a kind of commodity production without money. And this gave reason to Marx to think about the connection between commodity and money. Is it only a superficial connection so that you can get rid of money, or is it much deeper? His first result, Marx's first result, presented in 1859 in a contribution to the critique of political economy, was a kind of confusion. He confounded analysis of value form with analysis of the exchange process. He himself discovered these shortcomings in early 60s when he works on theories of surplus value, and he occupied with Samuel Bailey, an English economist in early 19th century. Bailey criticized Ricardian theories of value. Bailey said value always is only a relational category in the sense of relative value. And the Ricardians try to transform a relational thing in an absolute thing, which is not existing. And now Marx wanted, on the one hand, to criticize Bailey, but on the other hand, he also saw that the Ricardians were unable to criticize Bailey. So this showed that there was a massive mistake, massive shortcoming in the classical Ricardian theory. And by this, he learned that also he himself did a certain confusion in the book of 59, and this gave then reason for the first full presentation of value form analysis in the first edition of Capital. But because this first presentation of value form analysis was so difficult to read, Marx was criticized by Engels and by his friend Louis Kugelmann, and it was said nobody will understand. Marx then produced a much simpler version as an appendix to the first edition. And what we now read in the standard editions of Capital is much more close to the popularized appendix than to the strict presentation of first edition. So I just mentioned this, that you see you have on the one hand a certain progress in Marx analysis, but sometimes you have also a kind of regress of introducing some popularization which makes the things less clear. And also this is an argument in value form analysis very clearly. There is not one best version of value analysis, of value form analysis. When you really want to work on it, you need all the different versions. Now, my next point is fetishism. Also here we have an evolution in Marx thinking. It evolved rather lately. I don't give you the history of this because I always look to the clock and the time is running. In first edition, finally, it is treated more extensively, but only in the second edition, the fetish character of the commodity is put together to one section. It is a rather long section, but we can say nearly until the second half of 20th century, it was mainly ignored in discussion from Marxists as well from Marx critics. The interest started mainly in the second half of 20th century, but then very often fetishism was read as a kind of wrong consciousness. There is a deceiving of people. They believe that value is an objective property of things, but it is not. But this is really a misunderstanding of the theory of fetishism. Marx stresses that fetishism is a reality. Commodities have this feature. And why do they have this? Not as a result of a belief. No, they have this feature because of a certain practice, because of the way the producers relate to each other. They relate not directly to each other, they relate mediated through their products. And in so far, this Marx stresses in Capital, in the section on fetishism, the social properties of the producers and their labor become social properties of their products. This is a necessity in commodity production. The decisive, very short but decisive explanation in Capital, in Penguin edition, you can find in the pages 165, 66. I just want to read one sentence. Now I quote, "The labor of the private individual manifests itself as an element of the total labor of society only through the relations which the act of exchange establishes between the products and through their mediation between the producers. To the producers, therefore, the social relations between their private labors appear as what they are." This "as what they are" is very important. It says it is not wrong consciousness. They appear as what they are. They do not appear as direct social relations between persons in their work, but rather as material relations between persons and social relations between things. So I quoted this also before it becomes clear that value theory for Marx is not just a theory which explains us the exchange relations of different commodities. Value theory in Marx is a social theory. It should explain how in this rather perverse, and I mean this literally, in this perverse economy is possible. Why it's perverse? You have on the one hand a social division of labor. Each producer is dependent on a lot of other producers. There is a very strict social connection. But the production is organized as if all producers were Robinsons on a remote island. The producers behave atomistic. They do their decisions independently from all the other producers. And how this craziness that you have a connection, a necessary material connection by all with the division of labor, and nevertheless you behave as if the others wouldn't exist. How this can work, this special functioning of an economy should value theory explain. Insofar, it is a social theory, and in this social theory, exchange plays a crucial role. There are a lot of opinions who present Marx value theory determined by production already. These production-oriented approaches miss the special character of value theory as a social theory. They also miss the special character of a capitalist economy. So the question, depends value only on production, or depends it on production and exchange, is not a small theoretical question where you can write your PhD thesis about, but without much political impact. I think it is a very decisive question how to analyze, how to understand capitalism. And here, at this point, I come to the next very related of the critical issues. It is money. When production already determines value, then money is just the expression of something what already exists before. Not very important. In Marx, it's rather different. In chapter 3 of Capital, where Marx discusses the functions of money, he discusses as the first function measure of value. Marx there mentions that abstract labor is the inner measure of value. Already in the first pages of Capital, Marx stressed that value is a crystal of abstract labor. But now Marx introduces money as measure of value, and not just as another additional measure. No, he introduces money as the only real measure of value. Why? Why he's doing this? Because abstract labor, as I tried to explain before, you cannot find just in the production. When you measure labor with a clock, you always measure the concrete individual labor of a certain worker. Abstract labor you can only find in exchange. But in exchange, the commodities are exchanged against money, at least when we have it to do with an developed exchange in capitalist production. So money is the only real measure of value. Abstract labor is a strong analytical tool, but you cannot use it for a real measure. Money as measure of value has its own properties. It can measure value correctly, and it can measure value in a not correct way. Price and value can differ. And even more, money can give a price to something which has no value. Marx stressed this in chapter 3. So, when we now take these critical issues together, I think we can really speak of a monetary value theory in Marx. It is not a production-oriented value theory, it is a monetary value theory, where we, however, have also to regard that money in this theory is not just a simple thing as it is very often regarded. I just remind you the steps of analysis of money at the beginning of Capital. In chapter 1, necessity of the money form. Chapter 2, commodity owners act as character masks or personifications and forced to sort out real money, a commodity as real money. And chapter 3, the money functions, not as an arbitrary enumeration, but derived from commodity circulation. And this is not the last step in the theory of money. In volume 3, regarding credit, we will find credit money and fictitious capital and so on. So money itself is a complicated thing which plays a role or which is developed through all volumes of capital. So I said, taking all these critical issues, I tried to present to you briefly together. We can say Marx value theory is a monetary theory which needs production and exchange, production and circulation to explain something. And this story of value theory continues. It's not at the end in the third chapter. It continues with capital, not the book capital, the thing and the category capital. Also here we can say Marx presents a monetary capital theory. Already in chapter 4, when Marx analyzes the circulation figure MCM dash, money, commodity, more money, he starts discussing the form determination of capital with money, and he stresses that capital needs money as an independent expression of capital. Only in using capital you can also do all the accountings later with profit rate as a measure for valorization and so on. Production and exploitation come into the game already in chapter 5 and 6. They shall explain why valorization, which we found in the form analysis, is possible. It rests on exploitation. But you cannot reduce capital just on exploitation. Exploitation you have in every class society. In a society or in an economy based on slave work, or in a society like in medieval times on unfree work and so on. Everywhere you have exploitation. But to understand the specific capitalist structure of exploitation, you need money. And Marx himself stresses this at the end of the 5th chapter. Let me just read one short quote, which you can find in Penguin edition on the page 268, where first Marx described the contradiction in attempts to explain capital. So Marx concluded, now the quote, "Capital cannot therefore arise from circulation, and it is equally impossible for it to arise apart from circulation. It must have its origin both in circulation and not in circulation." So also capital is not something which you can reduce to production like value. You need production and circulation. And now when you look on the structure of the 3 volumes of Capital, volume 1 focuses on production after the first 5 chapters. And many people think, oh, this is the core of Marx's analysis of capitalism. No, the whole is the core. You need the 2nd volume on circulation, and you need the 3rd volume of the process as a whole, where profit and interest is introduced, such important categories. And from these two further volumes, the second and the third volume, you also can learn that you cannot make a division, which is very popular, between a so-called real capital and a speculative financial area, as if these were two different worlds. No, the same way as you cannot have a pure value sphere apart from any money relations, you can have a pure capitalist real production sphere apart from any speculation, money market, credit, interest-bearing capital, and so on. This is very important for understanding contemporary capitalism. And of course, it is very important when we want to fight against capitalism, when we want to overcome capitalism, we must really understand capitalism as a whole. However, my time is at the end. I had to speak here about value theory. So understanding capitalism as a whole is another story. I will finish here at this point, and thank you very much for your patience and for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mikhail. This is the place where there would be thunderous applause. I like to mark the place, what we're missing in this world. So imagine it's there. I should, they make us into these unwilling TV celebrities. We should at least have an applause track. I'm going to ask for that next time. Maybe not a laugh track. And so thank you very much. I want to ask people to put questions in the chat, which they're already doing. I want to start out with one question to you, if you don't mind. It's going back to the relationship between money and socially necessary average labor time, if you don't mind. I just want to hear a little bit more about this from you. I've read a lot about it from you, but I think it's good for people to hear. I'm thinking of the first page of chapter 3, where he says at the end, I'm going to read the Penguin, which we are working with my colleague Paul Reiter to update in a new translation. But they say in the Penguin, money as a measure of value is the necessary form of appearance of the measure of value, which is immanent in commodities, namely labor time. So I can understand you saying that bringing money back into the equation, let's say, and changing the revolutionary possibilities of the book by doing that.
Okay, the last remark is a little bit too pathetic to say, oh, now I change everything.
Well, you don't change everything, but you add, I mean, it isn't that, well, that's a long discussion. Anyway, that's my hope. But still, he has to call it a form of appearance. So I want to know if you could say more than what role does the immanent form have, socially necessary labor time, in the value form? Money measures it practically. I know that I'm going to measure value in money. We know this. What you don't know, what's being shown by Marx, is that you're actually measuring it in socially necessary labor time, which is a huge innovation, it seems to me, over the classical political economists and over the, let's say, a kind of empirical view of the economy, which says that money is the root of everything. It's really about money. Here, it's about how people's efforts, social efforts to make something are valued when they're put together with other social efforts to make things in the exchange realm. So I agree completely that it's between production and exchange that value arises. But what role does this immanent form play, and why should the form of appearance be given such pride of place?
This immanent form, this immanent measure of value plays the crucial role in understanding value. value is a certain kind of objectivity. Now we come to the translation problems. In German, I would say Gegenständlichkeit, a certain type of Gegenständlichkeit, thing-likeness, when I allow to construct an English word, a certain kind of objectivity, which on the one hand has features of physical objectivity, or analog to in an analog way to physical objectivity, but it is not physical. And this special kind of objectivity, I think, is one of the main discoveries of Marx. When you look to the history of political economy, there is a certain dispute: is economy a science, a natural science with physical quantities, or is it a kind of psychology because it deals with consumer preferences and so on? And the discussions are sometimes very stupid when you read this. Marx, I think, exactly in his value theory can show value is neither the one nor the other. Neither it has to do with physical quantities. It is not like a natural science, but it is also not a kind of psychology. And to understand this special objectivity, you need the term abstract labor, the difference, concrete and abstract labor. So it is a necessary step in the appropriation of our object of research. In the introduction of 1857, Marx made this nice remark relating to Hegel that we must appropriate in our thoughts the objective thing we do research, and this we can do only with categories. And so abstract labor is one of the decisive categories for this appropriation, but it is not at all a category you can measure. You can say 10 hours abstract labor. This term makes absolutely no sense. Here you need money. And when you talk about, or Marx talks about Erscheinungsform, form of appearance, we also have to be very cautious. Many people know this term, maybe coming from Hegelian philosophy. There is an essence and there is a form of appearance. And many people think, essence is the essence, the important part, and form of appearance is something hanging around, not so important. But this is totally wrong already with Hegel. Form of appearance is absolutely necessary, and in Hegel not to put apart from essence. And now read Capital Volume 1. Where do you find the term essence? Not in the first few chapters. You have form of appearance, but without essence. So this means also form of appearance is something different from what Hegel means, and also what many contemporary Marxists understand with form of appearance. But for our discussion, it is important, it is not any subordinated. So I hope I could give some ideas to your question.
Many ideas. I thank you for it. We have a lot of questions in the chat. So what I'm going to do, let's see, how many do we have? Maybe about 10. Yeah, I think we'll just do it the way we usually do, which is we'll start with the first one.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Michael, for this interesting talk. I just had a quick question about your claim that Marx begins the Capital Volume 1 with form determination instead of human action. But I'm very interested myself in those opening pages and the way that Marx says that a use value to a consumer is a necessary condition for a commodity. Otherwise, an object won't be exchanged and it can't have exchange value at all. And so it can't even be a commodity. So with that in mind, can't we say that commodities always begin with human action, and therefore Marx's account of commodities, even though he's obviously concerned with form determination, also begins with human action?
Okay, why don't we take one more? Does that sound right? Thank you, Tristan. Let's open up Michael Pulsford. Michael, you'll be next. Or if we don't get to Michael, or if Michael has left, I can read the question. That's fine.
Not think that they are still on.
Well, let's ask the question anyway for the sake of fairness. I'll go ahead and do it. This is from Michael. Did Marx say anything about marginal theories of value? And what do you think he might have said about value if he was writing a critique of political economy a few decades later when marginal theories of value were dominant? This is a great question. I would have asked it myself. So Michael, if you're listening, thank you. Okay, Michael, I think you're on.
Okay, shall I answer?
Yes.
Okay. Interesting questions. Maybe we will have a long evening. I will start with the second question of Tristan. You mentioned that Marx in the first section of the first chapter already stressed every commodity needs use value, otherwise it cannot be a commodity. And if this not means that he also starts with human action, when I've understood correctly.
Yeah.
I think Marx mentioned, it is totally correct what you said about Marx. He mentioned this as a kind of general prerequisite. It must have use value, and it must have use value for others, not only for me, then it's also not a commodity. But this general prerequisite doesn't constitute a certain approach on which is building. He also could say, when we have commodity production and exchange, it is done by humans. Humans have to breathe. Without breathing, there is no commodity production. But does this mean that Marx would have presented a biologist approach when just stating people always have to breathe? It would only give a very, very general prerequisite. And in such way, I would interpret what you mentioned. Marx says, okay, it must have use value, but now let's analyze the economic forms. And the action comes then in the second chapter, which already starts with this nice sentence: the commodities cannot go alone to the market. Therefore, we have to look for their owners. So also here, Marx makes clear, now we change perspective. Now first, we really come to the persons and the actions. The third question about marginal theory. This is really an interesting point. There were some very rough predecessors in British economy who also tried not to make use of marginal theory, but of utility theory. Marx knew them and counted them as vulgar economics. But I found no hint that he ever saw the Book of Jevons. The Book of Jevons was published in London in the year 1870. 71 or 72. A time where Marx was in London, where he followed economic discussions. Neither in a letter, neither in a draft, in a notebook, nowhere this book or another book of marginalist literature is mentioned. So, and I would expect to find at least a short remark, what nonsense nowadays produced or something, but no, nothing. Another book of Jevons, he knew about the coal production, the coal industry, a book which appeared earlier. So he also knew the name, but not this book. And insofar, I think he missed the rise of this marginalist theory. He was in 71, he was very occupied with the civil war in France, to write civil war in France, with the Paris Commune. Then he was sick. Then he was trying to finish volume 2 of Capital. And this marginalism, he missed this marginalism. And when he couldn't miss it because it was so broad in the 80s, he was dead. So he didn't see it. And you asked also what would be his estimation. Difficult question. I would say, or I would suppose his answer to it would have two parts. Stressing utility, he would criticize very heavily. To introduce mathematical formalism in especially the differential calculus, he would appreciate. He himself did intensive study of differential calculus since mid of the 60s. There are mathematical notebooks. Only one is published until now, but there are more mathematical notebooks which will be published in Mega. And from this you see that he really was engaged, occupying knowledge. He was not a researcher, a mathematical researcher, but he was a person who tried to learn all this calculus. So now the first question, which has several parts, and which I think not all parts are so narrow to my talk. One part is you mentioned a pessimist Adornian outlook or Adornian theories, and I think I also mentioned this in Brighton. Some people, some pupils of Adorno understand fetishism as a closed system. You cannot escape from fetishism. It is everywhere. If this would be true, then the question is, how can we talk about fetishism? When we are such imprisoned by fetishism, how can we analyze it? So this totally closed world by fetishism cannot exist, otherwise we couldn't talk about. And I would say fetishism is an always present background for workers, for capitalists, for academics, for non-academics. And we cannot escape this background. But how we react to this background, what this background is doing with us, has to do with our practice, our practical life, as well with our knowledge, with our intellectual life, what we do learn. And here, I would say, at least with these extreme Adornian pupils, I have big differences. You also mentioned pessimistic outlooks. this is true in Adorno and in especially, I think, even more in Horkheimer. You can find such pessimism. Also, this I wouldn't share. Adorno and Horkheimer, they had the experience of fascism. They had the experience of a nearly breakdown of human society by fascism and by the Second World War, and they had reason to be pessimistic. But in analytical terms, I think there is not such a good reason. And when Adorno and Horkheimer saw the hints that they have not to be so pessimistic, when the students' movement emerged, they had big problems with the student movements, I think also because they were in a pessimistic way prejudiced. Nowadays, I think we also have reason to some pessimism because a totally different situation, capitalism, is destroying so much the planet that perhaps the capitalism will have destroyed the planet and our foundations of living before we can succeed to destroy capitalism. It is a competition in time, and I must say I'm not sure if we will win this competition. So this could be a pessimist, also a kind of pessimism, but this would be totally different from Adornian or Horkheimer pessimism. But also in this case, I still have some hope.
Okay, thank you. We're going to do a few more questions. We'll start with my colleague, Paul Reiter. Paul?
Michael, thank you so much for your talk and for being here. I can't remember whether or not Paul said this, but Michael is in Berlin right now, so it's 1:30 in the morning, and the energy and lucidity at this advanced hour really are quite stunning. So I admire that and much else about this presentation. I want to ask a question that I've asked before, and so I forgive people in the audience who are maybe tired of this question by now, but this time is a little different because whereas I don't think the question has gotten that much traction with previous presenters, you actually have spoken to this issue a bit and seem interested in taking it up. And the issue is what it is on the level of rhetoric. How is it that this text lends itself to misreadings? And you talked about the popularizing formulations in the section on value that you think are a bit misleading. And I would be really interested to hear some examples of that.
Of the misreadings?
Or of the popularizing formulations in the 1872 edition that lend themselves to misreadings, misinterpretation.
Okay.
Michael, I'll read one that from the chat just to add to your list. This is from Anne Lee Summers. She asked me to ask the question, could Professor Heinrich comment on the usefulness of studying Book 4 of Capital, namely Theories of Surplus Value, in the context of a critical reading of Capital Volumes 1, 2, and 3? You seem to emphasize those three, but not so much the supposed or potential 4. Also, could you comment on the accuracy or usefulness of Alan Oakley's 1983 bibliographic analysis of Marx's critical theory? So that's 2 questions from Anne Lee Summers. And shall we give you one more?
Pardon, Alan Oakley's what? I didn't understand.
1983 bibliographic analysis of Marx's critical theory. I don't know that myself, but
yeah. I know the name of Alan Oakley, but this book I don't know. There I have nothing to say.
Okay. Now,
I will say later.
Okay. Shall we have one more?
Yeah, do another one.
Okay. So, Audrey, could you open Alan Spanotto?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you fine.
All right. I hope this isn't too narrow or technical, but I just wanted to ask, you had mentioned the value of a commodity can differ from its price, and that makes sense. There's all kinds of reasons why that can happen. But can the sum of all values of all commodities be different from the sum of all prices?
Okay, thank you. You know, this is a beautiful opportunity where you can ask both questions about the end of the world and incredibly technical questions, and Professor Heinrich handles them both with grace. Do you want to start with these, or do you want to ask? Do you want some more?
Maybe one more question.
Great. So, okay, this is a little bit off topic, but let's do it anyway. Could you, Audrey, open Jack Copley? Jack, are you there? Reminds me of all the hours I spent listening to talk radio in my life. They have someone who makes sure the person is there. I can read Jack's question if he's not on the list anymore. What do you think, Audrey?
Someone in the chat said that his mic does not work.
Okay, so then I'll read the question, sorry. He says, wonderful talk. Before capitalism, there existed in certain places and times money, wage labor, market exchange, private property, etc. Can we say that abstract labor and the law of value existed in incipient form on the margins of such pre-capitalist societies? Oh, he says his microphone doesn't work. I'm so sorry. I see it now. Okay, Michael, I'll let you go for those four.
Yeah, I will start with the last question. It is a very important question. We are very used to say money, commodities, even capital or private property exist long ago before capitalism. This is not completely true. We have to consider that all this property, money, capital in pre-capitalist societies is different. You have the capitalist property in nowadays, what is common to us is defined by the exclusion of others. When you want to define what is property, private property, I can exclude anybody else from the use. This is my ground. I don't allow you to use it. Then it is my property. This is a rather new constellation. In all pre-capitalist societies, you had something you can call private property, but with social obligations. The exclusion of the others was not the common feature of property. Also with money, when you see some coins, you think, oh, that's money. But also this is not true. You have on the one hand, the use of this coin followed in parts different rules according to the situation. It is money nowadays is abstract wealth, but the so-called money in pre-capitalist times was something bound in certain social relations. Even what we nowadays call functions of money were in some societies distributed to different bearers. A means of circulation was different from measure of value or from a storage of value. So you cannot just say, oh, this exists all the time. And insofar, I would also say there was not a double character of labor, like we analyze this with capitalist commodity, and of course not in the same way abstract labor. And this point is even discussed very briefly in Capital in the first chapter, when Marx made this excursus on Aristotle. Why Aristotle couldn't come to a value theory. He was restricted by the structures of his society. And one could add this, he was not that something existed and he couldn't see. No, it didn't exist in the way it exists nowadays. And this is also important when we now, especially with a Marxist approach, analyze pre-capitalist societies. We must be extremely cautious, not just to project our categories on the pre-capitalist society. Then our analysis will go very wrong. So now the second, no. The third, I can do it really the opposite order. The third question, value differs from price. And you ask, can also the sum of value differ from the sum of prices? I don't know how you mean this question. There is the so-called transformation problem. It is between value theory as it is presented in volume 1. In volume 3, we have a theory of production prices, and Marx tries to show that production prices still ruled by values. He even offers a way of accounting, how we can account starting with values, the production prices and the average rate of profit. But this accounting is wrong, what he presents. And the ironic point is that he knew this. He mentioned this, that this is wrong, but he said it doesn't play a role because he didn't want to go in details. Later on, it came out, it played a much bigger role than Marx expected this. I don't know if you have this in mind. When you have this in mind, I must say now is the time too short to come to the transformation problem. Then I first would have to explain what this means. I wrote about this in Science of Value, for example. So I must put the answer to the book. When you just stay on the level of volume 1, where I said, yes, money expresses value and it can express more or less value, then it is for sure that there is no necessary equation that the sum of all prices is equal to the sum of all values. It can be more, it can be less. So, second question about book 4. Here first we have to distinguish. You identified book 4 with theories of surplus value. This is wrong. This is definitely wrong. Book 4 of Capital, the history of theories, was never written. There is not even a draft. Theories of surplus value, as the name already indicates, is just the history of one category of surplus value. But book 4 should be the history of economic theory, what is a different thing. Furthermore, the history of theory, Marx wanted to write when he had all his categories. So presupposing the 3 theoretical books and the categories, he wanted to write the history of the theory. When Marx wrote theories of surplus value, he didn't have all the categories. It emerged in the big manuscript written between 1861 to 63, where he was in the middle of his research process. And this research process continued also after finishing theories of surplus value. The research process continued on the one hand regarding the theoretical categories, but it also continued on the field of the history of economic theories. At the end of the year 1863, Marx produced a new notebook, the so-called Beihefte, accompanying notebooks A to G. They were numbered by letters from A to G. In this Beihefte, they are not published until now. They will come in Mega, of course. But in this Beihefte, he widened his view on economic theory enormously. So theories of surplus value lack in several dimensions something what would make them even to a draft for book 4. It is only one category. The system of categories of the theory is not ready. And the research in the history of theory went on after theories of surplus value. So theories of surplus value is not the number 4. That the book is missing, that this 4th book is missing, is really, really a blow. Because in Capital, Marx always relates in footnotes, in small remarks to Smith and Ricardo. But we have nowhere a big presentation about Smith and Ricardo. And such a representation would be necessary, especially when you have in mind what I said at the beginning, that after Capital appeared, the marginalists came and they rewrote the history with these new distinctions. If Marx would have clearly defined his relation to the classics more than in the footnotes of Capital, it would be much more easy to say clearly the framework, what the marginalists offer for the history of theory, is absolutely not fitting for Marx. So that we miss book 4 has not only a scientific relevance, it also has a political relevance dealing with competing theories. So, and now Paul Reiter is left. Misreadings, popular versions. In the 2nd edition, you have mainly as value form analysis a reworking of the appendix of the 1st volume, which was already popularized, which also, I must say, has one big progress. The 3 peculiarities of the equivalent form appear for the first time in the appendix. This is really a progress compared with the version of the 1st chapter of 1st edition. But that the 4th value form of the 1st edition is missed or is replaced in the 2nd edition, this is a big problem, I think. This is a lack what we have. And there are also some historizing insertions that in value form analysis, Marx starts with historical examples. They only shall illustrate value form or the different value forms, but this, of course, supports this historical reading of value form. In the first edition, you didn't have this. Then you have popularized remarks also in other parts of the book, but they came not so much from the second edition, they come from the fourth edition. The fourth edition of volume 1, not prepared by Marx, but by Engels. And what did Engels do in this edition? He took the second edition, the second German edition, and looked what are the differences in the French edition. And also he had a small list of marks of changes he wanted to do for a third German edition or for an English translation. And Engels tried to combine this. Sometimes he did this very successfully. Sometimes he did this not so successfully. And the strictness in which Marx dealt with the category was a little bit blurred. In one case, there is even a translation mistake. Engels had to translate from the French edition to the German when he wanted to insert something, because there was not a German original of the French edition. And there is one small mistake. Okay, the sense delivers nonsense in the section on accumulation. And it seems that nobody realized that literally speaking the sense is nonsense. But these were very small points. The more decisive point is the overwhelming presence of Book 1, the overwhelming presence of the production process, which structured the perception of capital. So I wouldn't say there are so much misreadings or so much phrases in the second edition which giving cause to misreadings. I would more stress this special reception, putting production process in the center. This caused a big misreading.
Okay, thank you. It is about our closing time now. There are some more questions in the chat, and there's been some requests that one question get aired. And so I'm going to air that question as the last question with apologies to everyone else. That is a question from Lucas Gesser, and I'm just going to read it for the sake of time. There's been a lot of debate recently in Brazilian economics about the so-called modern monetary theory. Do you think it is compatible with Marx's analysis of capitalism? Make this the last question, with great apologies to all the people with also great questions in the chat. Michael?
Yeah, this is a good question, but I would say we have to put this in a little bit in a broader range. Modern monetary theory. Now the time is too short to say something what it is for the people who don't know the term. It comes from some rather radical pupils of Keynes from Keynesian school. And there is the broader question, Keynesian theory and Marxian critique of political economy, do they fit together or not? And here, I think we have, this question is prior. And here we have to deal with Keynes in a similar way. We have to deal with Marx. With Marx, I stressed, we cannot take everything for granted what the different Marxist traditions tell us about Marx. We have to see which categories really fit to Marx. The same is true for Keynesian economics. Keynes was very often reduced to a deficit spending policy, and in some respect, this modern monetary theory is a radicalization of this approach that we don't have to fear deficits, that deficits are good for the development of the economy. Keynes has to offer a much more elaborated analysis, but like Marx, also in manuscripts not published during his lifetime. During his lifetime was in the year 1931, the treatise on money, where he was half with one leg fixed in neoclassical theory and only with one leg beyond. And then in 1936, the general theory, where he tried to formulate a difference, a basic difference to neoclassical mainstream. But general theory, the published version, was already a popularized, moderated version of manuscripts which emerged between 31 and 36. There he developed a theory, a monetary theory of production. And this monetary theory of production, I think, has points you can connect it very easily with Marx. So there is the possibility to connect something, but not on a superficial sphere. And with modern monetary theory, I would say they have some good points criticizing the mainstream, but what they have to offer as a theory until now is not really a theory. It is some ideas about money and the state debt, which is rather premature. So it is good that this approach exists. It inspired a lot the discussion, but I think it is not something you can just easily integrate in a Marxian framework. But to repeat this, the radical side of Keynes' writings, which were not published in his lifetime, the manuscripts were found after his widow died in the 70s, and only then they were published. These manuscripts are very interesting for when you occupy this critique of political economy. In my Science of Value, which finally will appear next year, I make some remarks to these manuscripts. For the moment, I will stop at this point.
Thank you very much. Again, this is where the applause track would be. We will be waiting for the English version of the Science of Value. We appreciate very much your fortitude and your willingness to answer all questions, your movement from the technical to the revolutionary to the historical. It really is, it's a singular thing. So I appreciate it very much. Thank you for coming.